Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out to Medill on this frigid January evening for our event here this evening. It's a pleasure to have you, and I do want to thank you for coming out for what I'm sure is going to be a fascinating conversation with our guest, our honored guest here this evening. So I'm going to do the intro a little bit differently because this is a case that we're going to talk about tonight that relates personally back to one of my own experiences. So I had just gotten back to my temporary apartment near downtown Atlanta a little before 1:30 in the morning on July 27th, 1996, after a long day in the Tribune Company's Olympic Bureau. That's when my cell phone went off. An overnight editor on the Chicago Tribune's sports desk had the Olympic Games on the office TV. Quote, "I think a bomb just went off in downtown Atlanta," he bellowed into the phone. "I'm on my way," I told him. At the time, I was the very young sports editor of the Chicago Tribune, and I was in Atlanta overseeing the Tribune Company's Olympic Bureau. So a few minutes later, Tribune Olympic writer Phil Hirsch and I arrived at Centennial Olympic Park, where massive pipe bombs had just exploded during a crowded concert. The images and the sounds of that evening are still vivid in my mind. A cacophony of helicopters swooping overhead with spotlights blaring down into the park. Soldiers in Humvees and others on foot carrying automatic weapons racing to the scene. The deafening sound of sirens of what seemed like every paramedic van and fire truck in the state of Georgia descending on the park. Throngs of frightened people, many in shock, were hurriedly leaving the park. I stopped to interview a medical worker who had just treated some of the wounded. His shirt was covered with blood. Downtown Atlanta was a war zone, and the entire world was following this act of terrorism. After a couple of hours of reporting, I made my way back inside the Olympic Press Center, where I filed the front page piece for the Chicago Tribune's early Sunday edition 5 a.m. deadline. But as we know now, that was just the beginning of the story. What unfolded over the next few days and months is still being debated a quarter century later. Those events now are the subject of a new book and a new movie, and they hold lessons for all of us today. So we're fortunate to have with us this evening the journalist who co-authored that book, which explores what really happened behind the scenes of a botched federal investigation and what many consider to have been an overeager, rush-to-judgment news media. Indeed, the book contains important insights for every journalist, journalism student, and consumer of news in America. Medill alum Kevin Salwen was a reporter and editor at the Wall Street Journal for more than 18 years. He covered 2 presidential administrations and later became its national small business editor. After leaving the Journal in 2000, Kevin co-founded 2 media companies, and he's the author of the book, The Power of Half, One Family's Decision to Stop Taking and Start Giving Back. The story behind that book is remarkable in itself. Spurred by his then teenage daughter, Hannah, Kevin and his family made the extraordinary decision to sell their Atlanta home, downsize to a house half its size, and give half of the sale price to a worthy charity. That began a remarkable journey that transported Kevin and his family across the globe and well out of their comfort zones. In the end, they learned that they had the power to change a little corner of the world, and they found themselves changing too. The story of The Power of Half has been featured in the New York Times, in CBS Sunday Morning, in People magazine, and in Oprah. A 1979 graduate of Medill and a native of Brooklyn, New York, Kevin is a recipient of Northwestern University's Service to Society Award. He's served on the boards of Habitat for Humanity and Year Up Atlanta. In 2016, Kevin was a partner at Stanford University's Distinguished Careers Institute. So please join me in welcoming back to Medill, Kevin Salwen.
Thank you, Tim. That was very nice.
Great to have you here.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming. Kevin now lives in Silicon Valley, So he must really love Medill to come back to Chicago in mid-January to talk to all of us here tonight. But Kevin, we're grateful.
I walked outside at O'Hare and I almost turned back around.
Many of us have that feeling when we come back. So you've had an incredible career, a wide range of experiences: Wall Street Journal, an entrepreneur, author, and now a movie consultant added to your resume. So when you were trolling the halls of Fisk back in the late 70s, was this the career path that you envisioned?
Yeah, this precise one, actually, yeah. No, seriously, I've been thinking about my own career arc, and I don't want to sound like I'm doing my own eulogy, but for me, it all started with, I came here in 1974 as a cherub after my junior year of high school. And what fascinated me about journalism was the opportunity to be curious for a profession. And the opportunity to ask anybody any question. Didn't mean they had to answer it, but I could ask anyone any question. And I found that to be an amazing way to make a living.
Yeah, it really is. And you've done that pretty effectively, and you did that in the book. And we're gonna get to some of those questions. So let's not bury the lead. Your visit this week is incredibly timely. You just co-authored a critically acclaimed, compelling narrative nonfiction book on the Richard Jewell case and the '96 Olympic bombing called The Suspect, copies of which will be available for Kevin to sign after this event this evening. It was a source for the new Richard Jewell movie, now in theaters, and you worked with Clint Eastwood, who directed the movie, and the actors, including Paul Walter Hauser, Sam Rockwell, Olivia Wilde, Kathy Bates, John Hamm. Bates was just nominated for an Academy Award this week for her role. So you were a hard news reporter for so long. What was it like working on this movie?
Well, it turns you from a hard news reporter into a fanboy really fast, I will say that. When you're sitting across the table from that group of actors and they're asking you questions about their characters and things like that, it's pretty easy to fall in love. I will say that the movie obviously diverges a bit from the book. It's a feature film. It's not a documentary. They made some choices I wish they hadn't made.
We're going to talk about those a little bit later. Yeah.
But the reality is Clint Eastwood set out to do a story about an unsung hero, and Richard Jewell is very much that. And if you think about sort of the center of the bullseye is Richard Jewell, and the movie absolutely nails his character. Have people in the audience seen the movie? Yeah, a number of you have. Great. So, even to the point of early on in the movie, he's kind of a jerk. He's at the college. He's busting kids for minor alcohol violations. I mean, it'll be news to this campus, but college kids drink sometimes, and
not at Northwestern. That would never happen.
Oh,
no,
not since I left. But so I do like the way they portrayed Richard in the film, but it's kind of interesting because I think Clint Eastwood came at this to do a story about an unsung hero, and then the narrative kind of got spun into a place where that's not what came out. And instead it becomes about Kathy Scruggs and her sexuality and whether the reporter for the Atlanta paper ends up sleeping with her source for the biggest story of her life. And that's pretty much an unfortunate situation.
Yeah, I'd say, well, we're going to visit that in a second. But especially for those of you who have not seen the movie, we're going to run a trailer so you can get a feel for it. And I would ask Catherine, who's in the back, thank you for dimming the lights. Let's take a look.
All right, Richard, here's what we're going to do. We need a voice exemplar. I want you to say into this phone, there's a bomb in Centennial Park. You have 30 minutes.
Richard, you're a national hero now.
Thank you, sir. But I was just doing my job.
You always look at the guy who found the bomb, just like you always look at the guy who found the body.
Jewell fits the profile of the lone bomber.
A frustrated white man who is a police wannabe who seeks to become a hero.
We're running it.
You're a suspect.
You don't talk. I talk. Say it.
I don't talk.
This might be the only way to clear your name. I want you to say there's a bomb in Centennial Park. You have 30 minutes.
Stop trying to be their best friend.
I was raised to respect authority.
Authorities are looking to eat you alive.
There's a bomb in Centennial Park. You have 30 minutes.
I'm sorry, what?
His accusers are two of the most powerful forces in the world: the United States government and the media.
I do want to help y'all. I'm law enforcement, too. There is a bomb in Centennial Park. You have 30 minutes.
Did he do it?
Richard Jewell is an innocent man. He's a hero.
There is a bomb in Centennial Park. You have 30 minutes.
One more time, just a little louder.
I report the facts.
You've ruined this man's life.
There is a bomb in Centennial Park. You have 30 minutes.
Do a couple in a row.
My son saved people's lives.
There is a bomb in Centennial Park. You have 30 minutes.
You set that bomb.
There is a bomb in Centennial Park. You have 30 minutes.
I don't know how to protect you.
I think your client is guilty as hell.
They want to fry you.
You ready to start fighting back?
$74 from the critics on Rotten Tomatoes and 96 from the audience, just so that I'd tell you.
Yeah, it's very powerful, as is the book. And Kevin spun an incredible yarn in the book. Congratulations on the book. Meticulously reported. He reviewed 90,000 plus documents for the book, hundreds of interviews. But it reads like a novel. It's a real page turner. So congrats to you on the book. So some of us, not me, some of us in the audience probably don't remember the Atlanta Olympic bombing and what happened. So before we get into the details of the book and the controversy surrounding the journalism of the Richard Jewell case, can you remind the audience with a little bit of background about what happened and Richard Jewell's role in it?
So this is the largest peacetime event in history. 197 nations are invited to the Centennial Olympic Games in 1996. 197 countries send delegations, every single one of them, first time ever. 2 million visitors are in Atlanta. There's over 10,000 athletes. There's 15,000 journalists in town. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution thinks this is going to be such a big story, and it is for them, that they have dedicated 375 journalists to the Olympic Games alone. Think about that. Their entire staff now is 160, right? Which says a lot about the state of print journalism these days. And they are going to cover this story from every angle: economic development, marketing, ticket sales, law enforcement, as well as athletics. And the first week of the games, from an outward perspective, goes perfectly well. If you remember anything of those games, Amanda Beard is the star swimmer. She's 15 years old. She carries around a teddy bear. She's adorable as can be. Carrie Scruggs leads the U.S. Olympic gymnastics team to its first ever gold medal. On a hobbled ankle, she does this remarkable vault. She sticks the vault and then collapses into this, puddle on the floor. Her coach, Bella Caroli, knows how well she's done. He races over, he scoops her up. He ends up carrying her to the gold medal stand. It's just this marvelous moment. Behind the scenes, there's this security event that's going in quite a different direction. There are 30,000 people working security at the games. In the first 8 days, there are 103 formal bomb scares. I'm not just talking about somebody sees a package and reports it. I'm talking about there has to be the bomb squad sent in, either with water cannons or robots to examine packages. Because this is such a large and well-documented and widely broadcast event that any crazy that wants attention is going to jump into it. I don't know how far you want me to go on this, but one of those 30,000 people is a man named Richard Jewell. Richard Jewell grew up in the suburbs of Atlanta to a single mom, and he desperately wants to be in law enforcement. And so...
Catherine, could you cue the photos of Richard Jewell for us? Thank you.
Thank you. Look at that. There's photos of Richard Jewell. And if you look down in the bottom right, I guess it looks the same to you as it does to me. That's good. Bottom right. Richard Jewell finally gets a job in law enforcement in his mid-20s. What he desperately wants to be is a road cop. That's what he wants to catch speeders. He wants to catch people with their tail lights out. But he also is he's a little bit wily. He figures out, there's one story that I probably don't have time to read today. Should I read a quick thing? What do you think?
Sure, go ahead.
I'll do that. It's kind of one of my favorite anecdotes. I don't know if I can do it and hold the microphone at the same time. But
Want me to hold it for you?
either that or I'll scream. I can do this, I think, yeah. So Richard Jewell is probably 26 at this point. He has joined the Habersham County Sheriff's Department, where first he starts as a jailer, and then he ends up on the road. Jewell's real education, though, came during his 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. shifts. Night after night, he stopped speeders, worked car wrecks, served warrants, and hauled miscreants to jail. Jewell developed into a by-the-book cop with a particular passion for road duty. If a driver's taillight was out, he made a stop. Expired license plate? A stop. Over the speed limit? A stop. Drivers would find themselves staring into Jewell's rotund face, illuminated by flashing blue police lights. The stops were often an excuse for the deputy to put drivers through field sobriety tests. A near teetotaler himself, Jewell had no stomach for intoxicated drivers. For cases requiring backup, Jewell regularly teamed with fellow deputy Brian McNair. A slightly balding officer with wire-rimmed glasses and a knack for storytelling, McNair enjoyed Jewell's quirky style and humor. The two would become close. During one shift, Jewell and McNair were dispatched to handle a domestic dispute at the home of a suspected drug dealer off Route 441, the main highway through Habersham. As they approached the property, the officers were greeted by a pair of pit bull pups, probably about 8 or 9 months old. The call didn't take long. No arrests were made. But on the way out, McNair told Jewell, "Hey, that guy's bad news." Both deputies sensed they'd be back. Not surprisingly, about 6 months later, a judge issued a warrant for the same man's arrest on charges of dealing crack cocaine. McNair warned Jewell that this time the assignment would be much more dangerous. Aside from the customary risks of any drug bust, McNair explained that he had driven by the property several times since their earlier visit. The pit bulls had grown larger and had been trained to attack. Entry to the house would be perilous. But to McNair's puzzlement, Jewell seemed unfazed, almost nonchalant. "Hey, don't worry about that," he said. That night, McNair, Jewell, and 2 others on the high-risk warrant team met down the road from the property to formulate a takedown plan. They would approach by foot and surround the house. Jewell surprised McNair again. "Let me be first," he said. No one was going to object, but Jewell's bravado seemed odd. The team crept toward the fenced-in yard. As the other three waited by the street, Jewell climbed over and vanished from sight. Minutes later, he reappeared, waving his colleagues forward. They arrived to the implausible sight of both pit bulls licking Jewell's fingers. He was feeding them bits of hot dog. Dumbfounded, McNair asked, "Did they just take food from anyone?" "Oh, no," Jewell replied. "I've been feeding them ever since we were out here last time. I come back every week or two, throw them some scraps or something." Richard Jewell had been preparing for this takedown for half a year.
And Jewell had been preparing for a moment like being a security guard at the Atlanta Olympics. That was in some ways the penultimate moment for him at that point in his life.
Yeah, he had been fired from 2 jobs. He ends up getting fired from this job for wrecking the sheriff's car. He was in a series of he was just a horrible driver. He was fast, he was distracted. And he gets fired from that job. He goes to Piedmont College, which is where you see in the film, he's kind of waving the baton, and ends up being overzealous for that college, gets fired from there, ends up deciding, all right, I'll move down to Atlanta, and I'll work for the Olympics for the 2 weeks, 17 days of the games, and then I'll try to get another job in law enforcement afterward. He's very unlike any other security guard. He is absolutely more zealous. He patrols his tower. He goes up and down the tower. And this all comes into play when he spots a bag on the 8th night of the games. He spots a dark green bag, a military-style pack, underneath a dark green bench on grass, dark green grass, in the shadows. And he says to the GBI, Georgia Bureau of Investigations officer there, who's the park supervisor at the time, "Hey, what do you want to do about this situation?" As Jewell said later, "My 7th sense was telling me something was wrong." He even skipped his 6th sense. It was great. It was marvelous. And they end up calling the bomb squad that creep up to the bag. The guy from the ATF crawls up to the bag. He does what he shouldn't do. He breaks protocol. He uncinches the sack, which you shouldn't do because the clasp can often be the booby trap. And inside he sees what is the largest pipe bomb in ATF and FBI history. It's 3 huge pipes stuffed with explosives, wrapped, by the way, with masonry nails, about the hardest things you can find. And it is set to explode. Jewell races up and down the tower. He's pushing people out. He helps then set a perimeter, first 15 feet, then 25 feet. It's not easy because there's 50,000 people in the park. It's a party. Jack Mack and the Heart Attack are playing, this R&B band, and they're trying to not cause a panic, but he helps push this perimeter away. The bomb squad from Dobbins Air Force Base has now been called. This is bomb number 104, bomb scare number 104. They are racing down from Dobbins Air Force Base. It's a 20-minute drive, and they don't get there in time. The bomb goes off, but because of the work that Richard does, one person is killed by shrapnel, a woman named Alice Hawthorne, who gets a masonry nail right through her brain, and 111 people are injured, but very few seriously. And Richard Jewell is a hero.
Right. So it is an incredible story. So then the question becomes, and you talk about it extensively in the book, how does someone go from being a hero to being a suspect? And there was this profiler for the FBI who conjured the hero as perpetrator proposition. And it seemed like the FBI, there's all this incredible pressure, the world is watching, there are 15,000 journalists in Atlanta, everybody's trying to get the story. I don't know if you remember, but a plane had just blown up in New York a few days before the Olympics. So immediately people were wondering, is this an act of international terrorism in Atlanta? There's this palpable, and I felt it when I was there, there was this palpable sense of fear about, is there going to be another terrorist attack? Is this really, are these games safe? Are they secure? So how does that happen? How does Jewell go from hero to suspect?
Yeah, there's this, and you describe it well, Tim. There's this, really, it's almost this pressure cooker within the city of Atlanta. You know, the Atlanta Committee for the Olympic Games desperately wants the games to go on without a hitch. The FBI really wants to catch the person who did it, because they know that there's a bomber running around loose. And there's obviously these journalists who are all trying to get the scoop on the story. In particular, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, which of course has their 375 journalists. This is their hometown story. And so there's two other main characters in our book come into play. And the way we tell the story in the book is almost a novelistic type approach, a DNA type of interweaving characters. And I won't be too painfully metaphorical here, but you know, the Olympics is a time when not only the athletes are going for the gold, right? And these three people, these three lead characters, Richard Jewell desperately wants another job in law enforcement. The lead FBI agent, who is improbably named Don Johnson, yes, there is an FBI agent named Don Johnson. He desperately needs a win, and he is assigned to be the lead investigator on this case. And the material that he's finding about this security guard, some of it seems a bit suspicious to him, and he starts to truly believe that Richard Jewell is the perpetrator, and that he has set this bag under the bench. He has set up this bomb so that he can be perceived as the hero, and that he can be perceived as a guy who every law enforcement organization in America should be wanting to hire. So Don Johnson is working on building this case. Richard Jewell, at the same time, is being paraded around by his employer, AT&T, as a hero. He goes on CNN, where he has no media training. He wears all black on TV, which my Medill friends will know is a big no-no, right? Black hat, black shirt. He gets to the studio late because he can't find parking, so he has run there in Atlanta's 90-plus degree heat. So he's sweating. He is terrified of saying something that might ruin the case for the FBI, and so he's very circumspect in his answers. And he's doing this interview as a remote with Gene Meserve up in Washington, D.C., and so he's talking essentially into what looks like the bottom of a mayonnaise jar for his first ever media interview. So needless to say, it doesn't go wonderfully. Up in Quantico, Virginia, there's a group called the Behavioral Science Unit. And they are the people who were portrayed in Silence of the Lambs and in Mindhunter. And they are watching this. And they look at it and they think, this guy looks like he could fit the profile of a lone bomber. He's circumspect, he's sweating. You know, you always look at the guy who, as John Hamm says in the trailer, you always look at the guy who found the bomb. But Jewell's got all these attributes. And they write this 4-page profile that isn't a generic profile of what a bomber would look like in this case. It is a profile of Richard Jewell specifically, and it is scathing. This profile, by the way, was completely kept under wraps. My co-author, who was the U.S. attorney at the time, Kent Alexander, was able to see this profile, read it, and then he had to hand it back. And we ran across it in some of our reporting of that 90,000 pages of documents you were talking about. And it was kind of a marvelous find. And then we can get to Kathy Scruggs, but you had a question.
Well, so this case represents one of the most embarrassing moments in FBI history, right? So how did the FBI get it so wrong? Did they get hung up on this profiler's 4-page description of the bomber? Were they simply desperate to show the world that they had this thing under control at a time when the world was watching? What was it?
Well, there's multiple facets, and I won't get too deep into any of them because I know we want to talk about the journalism piece, but the profile absolutely drives the investigation. Don Johnson's work up in Habersham County when he chases the leads about Richard Jewell. You know, Richard's a quirky guy, right? So he walks into the park for the first time, and he walks over to another tower being built, and he says to the people there, so what's this tower rated? Would it withstand a blast? Now, why would you ask a question like that, right? He asked it because he was kind of intrigued with explosives, right? He liked to collect guns because he loved to hunt. Like most rural hunters, he took a picture of himself in camo with an AR-15. That becomes part of it, and all of these threads start to come together. But nobody at the FBI wanted this to be public. Nobody. But then somebody in law enforcement ends up leaking the story to the third major character in our book.
Okay, so let's get to the third major character, and that is Kathy Scruggs. And Catherine, if you wouldn't mind putting Kathy's photo up, that would be great. Thank you very much. So Kathy Scruggs is a cops reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and here's how you describe her in the book. Inside the sprawling AJC newsroom, Scruggs was the most colorful and divisive player among the rows and rows of desks. Many saw her as a delightful throwback to the 1930s newspaper wars. She was loud. She was profane. She would burst into the paper's downtown offices in a rush, slightly disheveled, hair pulling from its tie. Her future colleague on the Olympic security team, Ron Martz, marveled that Kathy never quite quietly entered a room. She kind of exploded into it. She lived in Technicolor, while much of the newsroom was in black and white. Over time, Scruggs accumulated often conflicting descriptors among her colleagues: tenacious, bombastic, rude, unsparing, wild, authentic. So how did these qualities that you describe of Kathy Scruggs converge in her reporting on the Richard Jewell investigation?
Yeah. So Kathy, she was provocative. She was, she would often dress in a way that the cops really liked. So in other words, her blouse was often a button or two further down than probably her mom would have approved. Her skirts were often very high. She wore fishnet stockings. Other people in the newsroom, especially women, really were angered by this. They thought she was setting back the progress that they had made as serious journalists by basically being, selling the sizzle. But the cops absolutely loved her, and she broke news constantly. And so what she would do is she would sneak into the local bar, Manuel's Tavern. She would park her Mazda Miata convertible in the back parking lot, reach into her purse, slip her hand past her gun, and put on a little perfume, and go sidle up with the homicide cops. And they absolutely loved her. And Kathy's perspective on the world was, I'm not in the business of being last. And when this story breaks, she decides, even though her editors, by the way, think it's going to be a tie, they think that everybody's going to get the name of the suspect when that person is charged or arrested at the same time. And instead, she decides she's not waiting for this. That's not her job. Her job is to find out who the FBI is looking at.
So did that desperation to break the story cloud her judgment? Or what do you think about her role in this?
So, spoiler alert, Kathy does break the story. And the way she does it is by working very hard with every level of sources. So, city, county, state, federal. And every day, in the first 3 days after the bombing, she is calling every source she can think of. So what do you know about the case? Who they looking at? And she learns from one of her sources that the lead suspect is Richard Jewell. Now, this is a delicious story because Richard Jewell is now a hero in everyone's eyes. That Tuesday morning after the bombing, Richard has gone on the Today Show where Katie Couric, America's sweetheart, brushes him on the arm and says, "They're saying you're a hero, Richard." And he says, "Well, ma'am, I was just doing the job I'm paid to do. The real heroes were all the other law enforcement who took shrapnel and got injured protecting the public." And he truly meant it. He truly meant it. What he doesn't know is that as he's leaving that interview and being taken home, the FBI is following him, and he is indeed the lead suspect. Kathy Scruggs finds out about this. She clearly is talking to someone who has seen the profile, because some of the words in the story that she begins to draft are very similar. Richard Jewell is a police wannabe, a wannabe hero. He is a lone bomber potential. And by the way, some of the other stuff in that profile is heinous. Things like, because he had been fired from his law enforcement job, he lacks what he needs to be a real man. And so he's going to be a hero in order to get his life back. Awful. But Kathy Scruggs brings that information back to the newsroom, and she says, "We ought to be running this story." And her editors kind of slow her down and say, "Hold on a sec, let's get this confirmed." She can't get it confirmed the first night. The next morning, as she's driving into work, she gets a page. She calls back the Atlanta Police Department officer who has called her, and he says, "Are you running a story about this Richard Jewell guy? Because his name is all over the place. We're hearing his name everywhere." And now Kathy Scruggs goes into frenetic mode. We got to get this in the paper. We got to get this in the paper. There are, remember, 15,000 journalists in town. They're the hometown paper. 1996, of course, is the year. So CNN is already up and running. But 96 is the year that MSNBC starts up, Fox News Channel starts up, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Chicago Tribune, a bunch of other publications all go online for the first time. So the pace inside newsrooms and the pressure inside newsrooms completely ratchets up. And if you think about it, it's also the year that we as news consumers start changing our expectations for what publications and media outlets should be doing. And it's the time in which we sort of start to say, okay, they don't have anything, I'm changing the channel. Let's see who's got the newest thing. It's very much a social media story set in a pre-social media age.
Yeah, and I want to get back to the social media aspect of this and what it means for current day news. So the movie has sparked considerable controversy in the journalism industry and beyond. In the movie, for those of you who have seen it, Scruggs appears to essentially trade a sexual favor with the FBI agent who gave her the Richard Jewell tip. Now, your book does not make that assertion. It does not suggest that. So and many in the industry have leaped to her defense. She passed away at a very young age, 42, I think, in 2002. Obviously can't defend herself. What is your take of her portrayal in the movie and the reaction to it?
Look, the portrayal of Kathy, for the most part, is pretty dead on. She would gloat in the newsroom about, there's a line that Olivia Wilde says where she turns to a bunch of the other reporters and it says, "I'm sorry that my great crime stories are knocking your boring ass shit off the front page," and that's a very Kathy line. But at the same time, Kent and I asked every single person we interviewed once we learned who the leaker was, which had not been disclosed before our book, why do you think the leaker provided Kathy Scruggs this information? And not once did we find a shred of evidence. that they slept together. And so, I think what happened was that the screenwriter took our phrasing of that she had a reputation for sleeping with her sources inside the newsroom, which is verifiable. She did have that reputation. Whether it was true or not is a different story. But
Why did you include that in the book?
well, because that is who she was. I mean, it was absolutely a belief that everyone when you do 187 interviews and 30 people have said, oh yeah, well, she slept with her sources. And every single one of those we would push back and say, okay, who actually did she sleep with? I guess I should be grammatical and say, whom actually did she sleep with? But, and most people would say, well, I don't really know, but that was her reputation. And so we wanted a reflection for how the newsroom viewed her, not how we viewed her, but how the newsroom believed she behaved. And it was an accurate depiction. But to make the leap, Kent actually described it to me one day as sex until proven innocent. And I think that's a pretty accurate description. I think what they did was they kind of wanted to, Hollywoodize it a little bit and pump it up. I don't think it was a good decision.
Yeah, I would agree with you about that. So, what is your take on the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's role in this? Defenders of the AJC say, hey, look, they accurately reported the fact that Richard Jewell was a suspect. Even Ted Koppel, I think has said that. So you reconstructed the AJC's decision to name Jewell on page 146, and here's what you wrote. Managing editor John Walter was steely. He reasoned that Jewell had put himself out there for his 15 minutes of fame. Scruggs had learned Jewell was the suspect and her sources were solid. An AJC intern saw the FBI at Jewell's apartment. For Walter and others, the pattern couldn't be ignored. How can we not use what we know? So what they reported was factual, right? What do you think of their reasoning in their decision to publish his name?
I think it's a fascinating one. I was in a newsroom at the time. You were in a newsroom at the time. I was angry that we were not able to run the story. We had heard Richard Jewell's name also. We did not have the same kind of sourcing that Kathy Scruggs had, where she had a person who was inside the room and absolutely knew who the profile had depicted. So her sourcing on the story was impeccable. And then the next morning, when she gets the call from the Atlanta Police Department, his name is everywhere, everybody's talking about it. They write the story, and then they read it to the FBI verbatim. Ron Martz, her colleague, reads the story verbatim to the FBI and asks two questions. Number one, is it accurate? And number two, will it hinder your investigation? And he basically gets the green light from the FBI on both of those questions. And so my issue is not so much, the question, I think, for journalists is, are facts and truth the same thing? And the reality is, these were the facts of the case. Richard Jewell was the lead suspect of the FBI in the Olympic bombing investigation. But there had been no charges, there had been no arrest. And then the question is, if you put out there that Richard Jewell is the lead suspect, is the immediate response of the news-consuming public that Richard Jewell is the bomber? And that's the unfortunate case, it is. And it's, I should quickly say, we don't moralize in the book. One of the things that I actually love about this story is that there's plenty of gray in there, and there's plenty of conversation that you could have about whether you would run the story, whether you would not run the story. There's no doubt that some of the behavior afterward of other media organizations was horrific.
Yeah, absolutely. And I, as a reader of the book, I appreciated the fact that you didn't moralize, that you sort of put all the facts out there and let the reader come to his or her own conclusions. So the detractors of the AJC will say Jewell shouldn't have been named, that the paper didn't take into account the impact that would have on his life. When I was running newsrooms, the general policy was you don't name people unless they're charged with a crime. Jewell had not been charged. So given the intense competitive pressure of the story, literally the world watching, did the AJC choose a big scoop over human decency?
That's a great question. I mean, honestly, it's a great question. They would argue that their responsibility is to write what they know. And everybody in the newsroom at the time recognized that this guy's life was not going to be the same. I don't think anybody really realized that how damaging it would be. So, as I said, there's 15,000 journalists in town. It's a social media story set in a pre-social media age. And so what happens is of the 15,000 journalists, there's almost no law enforcement people, no law enforcement reporters. They're sports reporters. And they're told by their news organizations, cover this and advance the story. And the way they do, including, say, the New York Post, which refers to Jewell as a failed fat sheriff's deputy and the village Rambo. And as you saw in the trailer, that headline of Saint or Savage, uses the oldest and most pathetic journalism trick in the book by adding a question mark to an almost libelous phrase. Because there was not a single person in the New York Post newsroom who thought Richard Jewell was a saint. So they give themselves a little legal protection with the question mark, right? Jay Leno calls him the Unidoofus after the Unabomber. Tom Brokaw goes on the air and he says, well, they have enough to arrest him, they have enough to charge him, but you always want to have enough to convict. So they're still making the case. An outrageously imprecise statement, right? They didn't have enough to arrest him. They certainly didn't have enough to charge him, right? And so from a news perspective, I think it's far worse. In fact, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution columnist Dave Kindred goes to the scene of the search a couple days later and writes a slice of life column of that the apartment scene and the search and the police reminds him of the scene of the Wayne Williams case, the Atlanta child murderer of the 1970s, the convicted Atlanta child murderer. So here's a guy who's not been arrested, he's not been charged, and yet he's being compared in the public's mind to a child murderer. I mean, it's fairly, well, it's not fairly shocking, it's damn shocking.
Yeah, no, it really is. So to fast forward, and then I'm going to open it up for your questions here in a minute. So Jewell sued several news organizations for defamation. Some of them, including NBC News, Tom Brokaw's piece you mentioned, and CNN settled with Jewell out of court. The AJC, however, fought the lawsuit, and they eventually prevailed. So isn't that some degree of vindication?
Yeah, the lawsuit was primarily over the first story. And in that case, the judge decided that the first story was basically true, that Richard Jewell was the lead suspect, and that Jewell was what he referred to as a temporary public figure. And within that context, then the Jewell camp would have had to have proved malice as part of their case. And couldn't and didn't. And so after 12 years, that case was dismissed. If what you're working toward is a standard of libel, of whether that's where your ethical standard should be, you're in deep trouble. Because the reality is that, and I think as the news-consuming public and as the reality is, look, we're if you have a Facebook page, if you have a Twitter handle, you are now in the publishing business. The world has changed. And it might be, I'll just throw this out there, it might be a time for us to start changing some laws as to when people get named and how they should get named. And I say this as an ardent defender of the First Amendment. But the reality is you can't put a genie back in a bottle. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, as I think you and I have discussed. Right. So once Richard Jewell's name is out there, he's no longer the hero. He's no longer even, a guy who did his job. He will always be known as either the former suspect or in many people's minds, oh yeah, the guy who was involved with that bombing, I don't remember how. Meanwhile, by the way, of course, the real bomber is still, was still on the loose and committed 3 more bombings.
Other bombings,
Yeah.
exactly. Eric Rudolph. So a couple more questions to put this kind of in the modern day, and then I'm gonna open it up to your questions. So the Jewell case occurred before the era of social media, which has only accelerated the news cycle to warp speed. Indeed, social media has added jet fuel to the rush to judgment tendencies of the news media. What do you think about this rush to judgment that we now see, that we saw in the Richard Jewell case, and that we now see playing itself out in the current environment?
Yeah, and we saw it in the Duke lacrosse players case. We saw it in the Boston Marathon bombing. So what happens is the rush to judgment accelerates. The world then moves past that, and the detritus left behind is the person who was named or the person who was accused, oftentimes tried and convicted in the court of public opinion. And it's very damning, and we as a society have moved to a place where immediacy has taken on more value than accuracy. And I think about, I'm not immune from this. I think about my own news-consuming habits. And if there's a big story breaking, and if I'm watching TV and CNN doesn't have something, instead they have one of their stupid talking head panels, I'm flipping the channel. And I'm going to somebody else who might have some news. And if they don't have it, I'm pulling out my laptop and I'm opening it up and I'm going onto my Twitter feed. And then I find something salacious, and oftentimes I'll share it in a way that many of these 15,000 journalists did the physical version of back in 1996. And I think as we've accelerated into this, there's some really hard discussions that we have to have about how we gather, present, and deliver information. But I don't think there are a lot of easy answers to this. I don't know how you tell people slow down and wait when we're all in the publishing business.
Yeah, I don't know how you fix it. I really don't. So we have a number of students here with us tonight. What are the lessons you'd like for them to take away from the Jewell case and from your own reporting on this?
Well, number one is slow down. There are certain things that are not knowable now. And just because you want them to be knowable now doesn't mean that they're going to be. And in the end, if you're known as the person who was more accurate than the person who was first with wrong, you'll be the hero in the journalism world. And I think about what the New York Times did, what the Wall Street Journal did, what you guys did, as being responsible journalism in this case, And I got to tell you something, it was really hard. At the Wall Street Journal, Amanda Bennett and I, who were running the Southeast news operations, desperately wanted to put the Richard Jewell story in the paper. And we were talked out of it. No, we were ordered out of it by Paul Steiger, who was then the managing editor. And it was a really great lesson. Amanda had told me a couple weeks ago that as she moved up the chain at first the Louisville, Kentucky paper and then the Oregonian in Portland, that she began to realize that what Paul Steiger had done that day was truly impactful for her. That it was the editor basically saying, slow down until we really know that we have the story, and that the story is not only factual, but it's true.
Yeah, there's a reason why Paul Steiger is a legend in the journalism industry. Okay, well, please, let's open it up to you for your questions. And then after we do the Q&A, by the way, Kevin will be outside to sign the book. Questions? Jack.
Thanks. I have a number of questions or observations, so I'll go with one, and then we'll play it around the room.
I had a guy at the Carter Center raise his hand and say, "I have 4 questions for you." And I was like, "What is this, Passover? What's happening?"
Yeah. So I'll go with one. And I don't understand on the lone bomber. First of all, I knew nothing about the 4-page, until your book, I knew nothing about the 4-page memo from Quantico at all. Why? I assume that the 4-page memo, because it uses the term lone bomber, was accessible to Scruggs and Martz when they wrote the story. It would be really coincidental if that weren't the case.
Scruggs' source told her that. We don't think she ever saw the document.
Funky, okay.
Yeah, but he clearly told her that during the meeting at the bar.
So that one source, the person who she supposedly slept with, had read the memo and then was reflecting that back to her.
Correct.
Any sense, does anybody know whether she knew that there was a memo but never got a chance to read it because they didn't leak it to her?
Yeah, it's pretty clear she knew there was an actual memo. In her story, she says he fits the profile of the lone bomber. So she knows that there's a document more broadly than just the conceit of a profile. You know, if you think about it, there's multiple profiling going on here, including, you know, the fat rural guy who lives with his mother and owns guns, you know, becomes in our mind's eye, you know, oh, well, of course he's the guy who did it. He looks like the guy who did it. Absolutely.
So that's the part I kind of don't get, because much of the criticism of the story, the first day story in libel circles, as well as I guess in Monday morning quarterback circles, was that reference, really, that fits the profile of a lone bomber. And much of the rhetoric, I couldn't believe it, is there is no such thing as a lone bomber. Who came up with the idea of a lone bomber? It doesn't exist. And as a reporter in those days too, we all had a sense of a lone bomber profile in some kind of way. So I was just kind of thrown by that, and then thrown by the defense about them not saying that there's a memo and going forward with that. It just surprises me.
Yeah, so a few things about that. Number one is Eric Rudolph, the real bomber, really does fit the profile of the lone bomber. He lives in the woods, off the grid. He's a Christian identity fundamentalist. You know, he's anti-government, et cetera, et cetera. He actually really does fit the profile of a lone bomber. And another behavioral science profile that's done a year later actually pretty closely nails him. But there's no doubt that Scruggs knew about the formal profile. But if you think about it, the Jewell camp never sued the government. They only sued for Bobby Jewell's Tupperware, which was marked up in the search. But his libel lawyers knew that they would. His attorneys generally knew that they would never beat the government in this case. So they only went after media organizations. And until our book came out, nobody on his legal team believed that there was an actual profile. They learned it from our book. And to this day, Lynn Wood, who is his lead libel lawyer, he believed that that the profile was something that was fiction for the AJC. But they never had to defend that there was an actual profile.
Hey, Kevin. So I understand that really upsetting transactional source for sex thing. Did you have any opportunity to object to the Hollywoodization of it, and how did that go?
obviously it didn't go well. The answer is yes. We made a point of pointing out in the screenplay that was not what we knew. We had no evidence of that in our book. But in the end, it's the movie that they wanted to make, and so we objected to it first. I don't know if we would say objected to it. We just made a point of saying we don't have evidence of this, and then they decided to go forward. And once they do that, our recourse is to say, take our name off the film. That's our only recourse. And Kent and I weren't going there. We didn't think it would land quite the way it did. Maybe that was naive of us in the Me Too era, but we stated our case and then walked away from it. Maybe shame on us, I don't know.
Thank you. So you talked about how you had someone leading you who made you slow down and think about the ethics, but what happens when it's the other way around, when you have someone that's leading you, trying to push you to, no, write this story, and you feel like it wouldn't be ethical for me to do it? How do you feel like someone can handle that in a position where they don't have the power?
Wow, that's a great question. And it happens in newsrooms all the time. And that's a place where I think it's a really difficult spot for a journalist. You can, at that point, put your job at risk, and that's often a difficult thing to do, but it is your opportunity. I also, I've seen reporters say, take my name off the story. I want my byline off that story. And I think, it doesn't get too much more dangerous than authority from the top mandating something that a more junior person has to do. That fits in all kinds of categories of not just journalism problems, but life problems. I don't know if you've seen the movie Bombshell, but there's a whole lot of that happening there. Not about stories, but about sexual behavior. So I don't have a great answer for that. Other than, do you have a good answer for that?
No, the pressure is intense, and you referenced the Boston Marathon bombing. And I used to be managing editor in Washington for Bloomberg, and the CNN broke the story that the Boston bombing suspect was in custody. Do you remember this? So my phone immediately rings from New York, and one of my bosses up there says, "Franklin, we got to put this out." And I had literally just had a conversation with our Justice Department reporter, who had just had a conversation with a very senior Justice Department official, and had been told that the suspect was not in custody. So I said, we can't go with this story because one of my best reporters has just told me that the suspect is not in custody. And the response was, well, Franklin, you better goddamn well be right. So we didn't go with it. The reporter was correct. The suspect was not in custody, and we didn't humiliate ourselves in the process. But the push, the tendency was CNN's reporting it, we have to go with this. But, that ability to take a step back, to verify information, is in the modern era of social media and, 24/7 news cycles, it's hard to resist. So
I think it's brutal. I
yeah.
think I would have a really hard time being a working journalist, a day-to-day journalist, minute-by-minute journalist, second-by-second journalist in this environment. I think it'd be really hard.
Right. Michael, I think back in the back, you had a question?
How are you doing, Kevin? I've been fascinated with the Jewell case for years, and I have a number of questions, but I'll just ask you one in regard to the film. I watched the film, and at the end, during the rolling credits and details, there was one glaring omission.
I love the credits.
There was no mention of the libel, the lawsuits that were filed. I thought that was very glaring. For those who watched the movie and didn't have any idea about the Jewell case, they were left misinformed, and I thought that I wondered whether you were consulted about that.
We were not. There were. I actually hadn't seen the title cards until I saw the movie at the premiere in November, and I was surprised at what they used and what they decided not to use. And I think the editorial decision that they may have been making there was see Richard Jewell as an unsung hero, not somebody who got paid off at the end. And, you know, I'm not kidding. I've had people at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution during the reporting process for this book tell me, well, the guy's life ended up being so much better than it ever could have been because he got money out of this he never would have gotten. To which I often respond, okay, if you knew you were going to die at the age of 44, not be able to have children, have PTSD for much of the rest of your life, would you take that deal for, I don't know, $750,000? Is that the deal you would take? Because I wouldn't. And so as to why they made that decision, I think they were trying to get to the human side of what happened with Richard Watson Bryant, his lawyer, and Bobby Jewell, his mother. And that's what they saved the title cards for, was just that human side as opposed to the legal side.
Okay, one more question in the back, and then we'll go out for the book signing. Yes, sir.
A little bit troubled by the advice, the lessons you're trying to draw from this of slow down or even the verify and do all that. That's good journalism, I suppose. But I think the real lesson here and the real problem, as you mentioned in the Duke lacrosse case where there were charges filed, the whole idea of slow down or wait for charges doesn't solve the fundamental problem. And it seems to me the real lesson from your book to learn here is don't trust law enforcement. Investigate law enforcement as much as you investigate anyone else and with the same fervor. And the fact that nobody brought out this profile until you sort of indicates that journalists, like a lot of the general public, trust law enforcement too much, and they don't bring that investigative approach to law enforcement that they ought to.
I think that's an interesting take, and I respect your thoughts on this. I'll just add that in this case, had they investigated law enforcement, they would have found that Richard Jewell was the lead suspect in this case. And I'm not sure how much that would have changed. You know, in this case, they had many reasons to believe that Richard was somewhere involved with the bombing or somehow involved with the bombing. I'll just add one other thing to the fact that you always look at the guy who found the device. He's not injured. He's, in fact, on the other side of the tower helping to create this perimeter. He had asked these kind of dopey questions, as I pointed out. He had been fired from multiple jobs, one of the calls the FBI gets is from the head of Piedmont College, the college where he works, saying, you ought to investigate this guy, he's kind of strange. I'm not saying he did it, but he's kind of strange. In 1984, just 12 years earlier, at the LA Olympics, a Los Angeles Police Department officer boards the Turkish team bus at LAX, and he finds a bomb. In this incredible moment, he grabs the device, he runs off the bus, he races down the tarmac to put the bomb in a safe place. The LAPD lauds him as a hero. In fact, Police Chief Gates says it's the most heroic thing he's ever seen. The next day they learned the entire thing was a hoax, that that officer had actually planted that device, which was a dummy device, and he had done it because he wanted to be noticed for the job he was doing. The police chief the next day said, well, he's been noticed. He went to jail. So, you know, when you start to pull these threads together, there's actually a really good reason why Richard Jewell was a suspect. And the fact that he gets elevated to the lead suspect, you could make an argument he should or shouldn't have, but there's no doubt that he was. So I don't dispute your skepticism about law enforcement. In fact, I absolutely sign on to that. But in this case, I'm not sure how much it would have mattered.
Okay, well, yeah.
Why didn't they put McNair in the pit bull in the movie? That is the best scenario I've heard between your book and the movie.
Oh, yeah, boy, I don't know. You know, it's a 2-hour feature film, you know? So, yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank all of you for coming out this evening to listen to Kevin and listen to us, so thank you. And let's give a round of applause to Kevin Salwen. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
Sure. So we'll let Kevin make his way outside, and I'm sure he'd be happy to talk to you there.
Thanks, man. Thank you. That was fun. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Drink my water. Drink it out there.